Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. I've got my coffee as always, but today's brew is extra strong because we're tackling a topic that's always a bit spicy.
Ooh.
Censorship versus free speech.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic debate, you know? Makes you wonder where you draw the line.
Yeah, for sure.
It's tricky.
It is. It's a tough one.
Okay, so let's just dive right into this. We've got a whole stack of articles and research here.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out if censorship is ever justified.
Right.
Or if free speech should always kind of reign supreme.
Right. We've got some interesting perspectives here. Like some folks are all about censorship, especially online.
Interesting.
They argue that it's crucial for keeping things civilized.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
less misinformation.
Yeah.
Less hate speech, less toxicity.
Less toxicity online. That's appealing.
Right. It sounds pretty peaceful.
Yeah, I get that.
Right.
But then you've got the other side.
You got the other side.
Yeah, the free speech absolutists.
Right. Who say any kind of censorship is a slippery slope to tyranny.
It's true.
And they bring up examples like, you know, the Soviet Union,
Oh, yeah.
Nazi Germany, where controlling information was really key to those regimes' power.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah, because how do you balance the potential harms of like unchecked information with the dangers of giving someone the power to decide what we can and can't say?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
Who gets to be the ultimate truth teller?
Yeah.
And what about all the different opinions and ideas that might get squashed in the process?
Right.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It makes my head spin, honestly.
Well, how about we take a sip of our drinks?
Okay.
And then use a real world example to help us kind of think this through.
Perfect. Love it.
All right.
Okay, so let's talk about China.
Okay.
They're kind of famous for their censorship, right?
Very much so. Yeah, the Great Firewall blocking websites,
Right.
controlling the narrative, the works.
The works. And, you know, one of the sources that we have actually argues that this approach to censorship in China, especially in education, might actually be backfiring a bit.
Really?
They're calling it unintentional misinformation.
Unintentional misinformation. What is that?
I know, right?
That sounds counterintuitive.
It does. How does that work?
Well, think about it. Like, if you grow up only being exposed to one carefully curated version of history or current events, you might develop a pretty skewed understanding of the world.
So it's like they're trying so hard to control the message
Yeah.
that they end up accidentally creating a generation
Yeah.
that's kind of misinformed.
Yeah, precisely.
Wow.
And this source even suggests that this could have some pretty serious long-term consequences.
Righto.
Like making it harder for people to engage in critical thinking or understand complex global issues.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's big.
It really makes you wonder about the unintended ripple effects of censorship, even if the intentions behind it might seem good on the surface.
Absolutely. And it all ties back to our earlier conversation about who gets to decide what's true and what's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so China's censorship is clearly a big deal.
Huge.
But it gets even more complicated when you bring Taiwan into the mix.
Oh, yeah, that's where the geopolitics really heat up.
Right.
You know, China sees Taiwan as absolutely essential to their whole national rejuvenation narrative.
National rejuvenation, what does that even mean?
Basically, it's their idea of restoring China to its former glory, you know, becoming a global superpower, the whole shebang.
Right.
And they see Taiwan as this missing piece of the puzzle.
Okay, but Taiwan has their own government, their own culture, their own everything.
Right.
It's not like some empty island just waiting for China to reclaim it.
You're telling me.
Yeah.
But China's government views Taiwan as a breakaway province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland. And they're not afraid to use censorship to push that narrative both internally and on the global stage.
See, this is what I don't get. They're
Yeah.
so insistent on reunifying with Taiwan, claiming it's all about territorial integrity.
Right.
But then you look at their history, and they've actually lost huge chunks of land to other countries.
Like who?
Like Russia, for example.
Oh, yeah.
There's this treaty, the Treaty of Agun, signed back in the 1800s, where Russia basically took a massive amount of territory from China.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're actively campaigning to get that land back.
Right.
It makes you wonder if the whole territorial integrity argument is a bit selective, wouldn't you say?
Totally. It's like they're picking and choosing which territories are worth fighting for based on
I don't know.
who knows what.
Yeah.
Strategic importance, political convenience.
Maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you question their true motives, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of questioning motives, this whole situation with Taiwan feels a bit like what's happening in Ukraine. Well, think about it. Russia invades Ukraine, claiming they're fighting for justice and to liberate the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
And China's using similar language about reunification and protecting the Taiwanese people.
I see what you're saying.
Right.
I see where you're going with this.
It feels like a dangerous pattern.
Yeah.
Powerful countries using these grand narratives to justify aggression and territorial expansion.
Yeah.
And Taiwan, just like Ukraine, ends up caught in the middle.
That's a pretty chilling thought, and it really highlights the stakes here, you know? We're not just talking about an abstract debate about censorship. We're talking about potential real-world conflicts.
Yeah.
Devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And all this talk about potential invasions and conflicts is making me feel a bit stressed out, to be honest.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in. How about we take another sip of our drinks?
Okay.
And maybe try to find a bit of common ground here.
Yep.
After all, neither of us is a geopolitical expert, right? We're just two people trying to make sense of this complicated world.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we can both agree that peace is better than war.
Right.
Right?
Totally.
And that dialogue and diplomacy are always worth pursuing.
100%.
Even when things seem really difficult.
Yeah, and maybe by talking about these issues openly and honestly, by questioning assumptions and considering different perspectives, we can contribute to a more peaceful and understanding world.
You know what? I really like that thought. It gives me hope.
Yeah.
And after all, hope is what keeps us going.
It does.
Especially when we're diving deep into topics as heavy as this one.
That reminds me of something I read in one of the articles about China's censorship.
Okay.
They were talking about how difficult it is to get accurate information about what's really going on inside the country, especially from people who live there.
Right.
Yeah, with all the restrictions on free speech and access to information, it must be really hard for people to share their perspectives openly without fear of repercussions.
That makes sense. Yeah. And it makes you realize that even though we might complain about things like biased media or annoying algorithms, we still have a lot of freedom to access information and express our opinions compared to people living under much stricter regimes.
So true.
That's such an important point.
It is.
It's easy to take those freedoms for granted.
Yeah.
Until you see what it's like when they're taken away.
Absolutely.
You know, this whole conversation about China's censorship and their stance on Taiwan got me thinking.
Okay.
What would happen if they actually succeeded in taking control of Taiwan? What would that mean for the people living there?
Yeah.
It's something that doesn't get talked about enough, I think.
It's a question that keeps a lot of people up at night. There's a real fear that Taiwan, which has this vibrant democracy and thriving culture, would be subjected to the same kind of restrictions and controls that exist in mainland China.
And that would be a huge loss, not just for the Taiwanese people, but for the world as a whole.
Yeah.
You know, Taiwan is a beacon of democracy and innovation in a region that's increasingly dominated by authoritarianism.
Absolutely. Losing Taiwan would be a major setback for human rights and freedom of expression in the region, and could have ripple effects around the globe.
It's a sobering thought, but I think it's important to acknowledge the potential consequences of inaction.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and hope for the best. We need to be actively engaged in supporting Taiwan's right to self-determination and pushing back against any attempts to undermine their democracy.
I couldn't agree more. And part of that is staying informed, having these conversations, and making sure that Taiwan's story is heard loud and clear.
Well said. You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
From the philosophical arguments about censorship to the very real geopolitical implications of China's actions. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And I think we've both learned a lot along the way.
Me too.
But you know what? I think we need to take a quick break to refill our drinks and collect our thoughts. This stuff is intense. We'll be back in a jiffy to continue our exploration of this complex world of censorship and free speech. Don't go anywhere, listener.
See you in a bit.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it. Welcome back to Sip&Talk. Our drinks are topped off.
Yes.
And we're ready to dive back into this fascinating and slightly overwhelming world of censorship. Where were we?
Right. We were talking about the potential consequences if China were to take control of Taiwan. And it's scary to think about what that could mean for the people living there. It's like their whole way of life could change overnight.
It's true. It is a sobering thought. And it makes you wonder if there are people in China who are pushing back against this idea. You know? Are there dissenting voices within China itself?
That's a great question. I mean, it's hard to know for sure because of the whole information control thing.
Right.
But I'd like to think there are people even within the government maybe who see the potential downsides of a conflict with Taiwan.
Yeah, totally. And one of the sources we have actually touches on that apparently there are some intellectuals and academics in China who are raising concerns about the long-term impacts of censorship, not just on freedom of expression, but on their society's intellectual development as a whole.
Hold on, so they're worried about censorship making their own country less smart.
Well, kinda. It's more like they're concerned about becoming intellectually isolated from the rest of the world. They argue that if you're only exposed to one set of ideas, one carefully controlled narrative, it stifles creativity and innovation.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
How can you come up with new ideas, new solutions, if you're not allowed to think outside the box?
Right.
Or even know that there is a box?
Exactly. And they also worry about the impact on critical thinking skills if you're never allowed to question the information you're given. How do you learn to discern truth from falsehood? How do you develop your own opinions?
It's like they're trading short-term control for long-term stagnation. Not exactly a recipe for becoming a global superpower, is it?
Definitely not. And it makes you wonder about the trade-offs that governments are willing to make, even in countries that aren't as restrictive as China.
You know, this whole conversation reminds me of a time when, okay, so this might sound silly, but it was back in college. I wrote this paper arguing against a policy that the university was trying to implement, a policy that I felt was really restricting students' freedom of expression.
Whoa, rebellious college host speaker. I love it. What happened?
Well, I was super nervous to submit it,
Yeah.
thought I might get in trouble or something. But my professor was actually really impressed.
Yeah.
He said it was one of the most well-argued papers he'd read all semester. He even helped me get it published in the student newspaper.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
So what's the takeaway here? What does college host speaker have to teach us about censorship and free speech?
I think it's about the importance of speaking up, even when it's scary, even when you think your voice might not matter, because you never know who you might inspire or what kind of impact you might have.
Love it. You go college host speaker. Okay, so circling back to China and Taiwan, we've been talking a lot about the potential negative consequences of a conflict, but are there any potential benefits that China might see?
Well, obviously, they gain control of a strategically important island. And Taiwan's economy is pretty significant, especially when it comes to technology and manufacturing. So there's definitely an economic incentive there.
Right, especially that semiconductor industry you mentioned earlier. Taiwan is a global leader in that, and controlling those resources would be a huge win for China. But those economic benefits have to be weighed against the potential costs, right?
Exactly. And the cost could be massive. We're talking about potential military casualties, economic sanctions from other countries, damage to their international reputation. It's a huge gamble.
And don't forget, the human cost war always brings suffering, and the people of Taiwan would bear the brunt of it. It's heartbreaking to think about.
It really is. And I think it's important to remember that these geopolitical issues aren't just abstract concepts. There are real people with real lives caught in the middle of all this.
One of the things that struck me while reading through these sources is how much emphasis China puts on historical narratives. Like, they're constantly invoking this idea of a shared history and cultural unity between mainland China and Taiwan to justify their claims. It's almost like they're trying to rewrite history to fit their political agenda.
That's a really interesting observation, and it makes you wonder how much of this conflict is actually about history versus just raw power and control.
Right. Are they genuinely motivated by a desire to reunite with their lost brethren, or is it more about expanding their influence and becoming the dominant force in the region? It's hard to say for sure.
And this whole idea of using history to justify political actions is something we see all over the world, not just with China. It's a powerful tool, but also a dangerous one because it can be so easily manipulated.
Totally. And it makes you realize how important it is to be critical of the information we consume, to question narratives, and to seek out multiple perspectives, because history is never black and white.
This conversation is making my head spin a little. We've gone from college censorship to global power dynamics in the blink of an eye.
I know, right?
It's a lot to process.
It's like we're peeling back layer after layer of complexity.
Maybe we need another sip of our drinks to help us digest all this information.
Agreed. Let's take a moment to refill our glasses and gather our thoughts. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into censorship and free speech.
All right, we are back. Ready for this final stretch of our deep dive. I feel like we've been around the world and back with this whole censorship discussion.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah. It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, governments, wars, all that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to bring it back to the individual level.
I agree.
How does censorship actually affect people's lives?
Right, like on the ground.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really struck me from the sources is the psychological impact of censorship.
Oh, interesting.
It's not just about limiting information. It's about creating an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
it's like even if you could speak your mind,
right,
you might be hesitant to.
Exactly.
Because you're worried about the consequences.
Yeah, and that can be really damaging, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. It creates this chilling effect where people are afraid to challenge the status quo, to question authority, to think differently.
And without that kind of free and open exchange of ideas, progress stalls.
Right.
Right? Innovation suffers.
For sure.
It's like everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to make a mistake.
Yeah.
Afraid to say the wrong thing.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most insidious things about censorship is that it can be so subtle, so pervasive that you don't even realize it's happening until it's too late.
It's true. This whole conversation has made me really appreciate the freedoms that we have here. The freedom to speak our minds, to access information, to disagree with each other without fear of reprisal. It's something we should never take for granted.
I completely agree, and I think it's something that we need to actively defend both here at home and around the world, because censorship in all of its forms is a threat to democracy, to progress, and to our shared humanity.
Well said. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. Historical examples, philosophical arguments, geopolitical tensions, personal anecdotes.
It's been a lot.
It has.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that there's no easy answer to the question of censorship versus free speech.
Right.
It's a complex issue with no one-size-fits-all solution.
Very nuanced.
Very nuanced, yes. But I think the key takeaway here is the importance of critical thinking, questioning narratives, being aware of our own biases, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
And having these tough conversations,
Yes.
even when they're uncomfortable.
Even when they're uncomfortable.
Because avoiding them won't make the problems go away.
Absolutely. So, listener, what are your thoughts on all of this? Where do you draw the line between censorship and free speech? What are the limits, if any? It's a question worth pondering.
For sure. And hey, if you're looking for even more food for thought, definitely check out the Micky channel.
Yeah.
They've got some great content that delves into these issues even more in depth.
Big shout out to Micky, always bringing that insightful and engaging content.
Always.
Okay, well, it's time for us to wrap up this episode of Sip and Talk. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of censorship and free speech.
Cheers to that.
And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those conversations flowing until next time.
Okay.
Peace out